Obviously, a very critical question when determining the price of a product is to identify how much customers are willing to pay. And we call this the question of price sensitivity. And in the next section, I want to talk about how price sensitivity can be measured. And in principle, the different approaches to measure price sensitivity can be grouped along two dimensions, which gives us four different groups. The first dimension is whether we measure things in real life. We call this an uncontrolled environment, or whether we measure it in some form of laboratory setting, which would be a controlled environment. And the second dimension is whether we observe what people actually do, which usually would be a purchase, or whether we observe what people say they will do, which would be intentions. Now, if you cross those two dimensions, you get four different groups, and we are going to talk about each of these groups now in more detail. Let's start with the top left, which is uncontrolled environment and actual behavior. If you want to find out how sensitive demand or sales is to prices, one very intuitive way of looking at this could be that you just look at your sales data, right? Assume you are a fast-moving consumer goods company, assume you are Coca-Cola. Your first idea could be that you look at how many cans of Coke did we sell in a given week, and what was the price that we charged in that given week. So this is the question of aggregate sales data. Now, the problem with aggregate sales data is that these questions usually, this data does not lend itself to this type of question unless you have a form of direct distribution. So if Coca-Cola had a website where people can order the amount of Coke they want, and then they ship it directly to the customer, then this approach might work. But in most settings, there's a very complex supply chain involved into this. Coca-Cola may ship to a reseller or to a wholesaler, who then may ship to a retailer, who may keep the items on stock for several weeks until they ultimately sell it. So there may really not be a very close link between what you see as quantities leaving your factory and whatever people do at the checkout at the moment. So aggregate sales data usually reflect shipments to resellers and not end user purchases. If you want to go down this road, if you want to look at actual behavior in an uncontrolled environment, you usually need panels. Now, I'm sure you know about panels from a class on marketing research, and if not, I encourage you to read up on it. But just to give you a brief reminder, there are two different types of panels. There are what is called distributor panels and consumer panels. Distributor panels is essentially a random selection of supermarkets in a country that more or less give a copy of every single checkout ticket to a market research company. So the data is provided through the retailer scanner system, which means through a distributor panel, you see precisely on a weekly or on a daily level how many cans of Cokes have been sold at which given price. So it gives you information about purchases and price paid for your own products as well as for your competing products. And you can use then this data in order to make any kind of analysis you want to make. There's also something which is called consumer panels. The data in consumer panels does not come from the retailers. It comes from the consumers. So essentially people at home scan the individual items they purchased and enter the prices they paid for it. This allows you to calculate things like penetration, frequency, and usage. You may know penetration is the share of the population who buys your product. Frequency is how often do people buy the product in a given month or year, given they buy it. And usage is if people buy it, how much is the quantity they buy. And you can then look at price sensitivity using this data and correct or control for certain customer level information like demographics or where people live. Now, but even panel data has one problem, and that is if you want to see how demand changes with changing prices and you want to rely on panel data or more generally on actual behavior in an uncontrolled environment, the only option that you have is to actually change prices in real life. So if Coke wanted to find out how demand changes if prices go from 10 cents to 10 euros per can in 10-cent increments, they would need to charge 10 cents in 1 week, 20 cents in the first week, 30 cents in the third week. And this is obviously really, really hard to implement, both out of strategic and practical reasons. So another approach may be to work with actual behavior in a controlled environment, and this can be a test market. So a test market is more or less like an artificial supermarket. It can be a physical test market. In France, you have two of those, one in Angers and one in Le Mans, where there are actual supermarkets with actual consumer buying actual things. These consumers know that this is a test market, so they may know that this is a very specific type of supermarket, but the supermarket looks exactly like a normal supermarket. And what is important is the supermarket users, the consumers, they do not know which specific product or price is currently tested there. You can use a physical test market, for example, when you want to introduce a new product. Assume Coke wanted to introduce a vanilla flavored version of Coke. They could put it in a shelf in a physical test market and see whether people buy it. Although the consumers may know they're in a special type of supermarket, they would not know which specific type of Coke is the one that is currently tested and that is only available in their store. And you could do the same thing with prices. You can charge different prices in that supermarket. Consumers would not know that the item is probably priced differently in other supermarkets, and you can then see how demand changes with prices. You can do the same online, and then you call it a simulated test market, which you can imagine either like a kind of Amazon, an online shop, or like in the graph that I showed you here, a 3D type of environment where you can walk around in form of an avatar, for example. The problem with these type of settings is that they can be very costly and time consuming. In order to get a product into a test market, a physical test market at least, it may require a lot of wait time because these test markets tend to be crowded. And if Pepsi is testing something, they may not allow Coke to test something at the same time. They are run by market research agencies. So it might not be the best thing either if you want to find out how demand changes for different levels of price. And this is why companies usually would wish to rely on some form of questionnaire, which then is stated behavior. So we are no longer looking at what people actually do, but what people tell us what they are planning to do. The easiest is obviously direct questioning. How much would you be willing to pay for a 3D printer? How much would you be willing to pay for the new iPhone? Whatever it is you want to sell. The problem with these type of questions is that they may give very, very misleading answers. Assume you have 3 different types of people in the market. Customer 1 is really interested in buying a 3D printer. They listen to you asking the question and they think as follows. You ask me what I would be willing to pay for a 3D printer. I want to buy a 3D printer and I want to make a good deal. So the number that I'm telling you for my willingness to pay will be lower than what I'm actually willing to pay because I know you will use my answer to set your prices. And if I give you a lower answer, you set a lower price and I make a good deal. This is a bargaining reflex, which people do when they understand the true willingness to pay because they want to make a good deal. Other customers will probably say, well, I'm not interested in buying a 3D printer anyway, so I just give you a randomly high price because apparently it's a new product that is important to you, so I don't want to be too cheap in order to disappoint you. And a third group of people may actually try to give you the real answer of their willingness to pay. Now, the problem is if you ask 100 people, you do not know which percentage falls into each of these groups. The only thing you see is an aggregated average. And this aggregated average may be so biased through the bargaining reflex or this avoidance of being too cheap that it might be largely meaningless. What you can do is you can do surveys, or in this case, more in-depth interviews to find out how people use product, which needs the product satisfies for them, and which type of substitutes they use. And this may help you in calculating how much the product is worth for the customer in the logic of economic value, which we talk about in the next session. For example, if you are Evian selling water and you make the in-depth interviews and some customers tell you that they use the Evian water to water their plants because they think their plants grow nicer with Evian than with tap water, then you can decide if this is probably something you want to position your brand against. You could run a whole advertising campaign saying that Evian water can be used to drink and to water your plants. If it works, you would increase usage, you would increase frequency, and you would probably increase sales and profits in the medium term. Now, if you want to go down to prices, since you cannot really use direct questioning, one way you can do is you can do a buy-response survey. Would you buy a 3D printer if it cost $300? Yes or no? The answers may still be biased for the same reasons as highlighted above, but they tend to be much less biased than if you ask people to actually give you a number in terms of their price. And ultimately, there are auction methods, which, well, are used by any auction house, right? When you have one item, and there are different ways of it. The classical one is people bid higher and higher, and at some point, the person who has the highest willingness to pay gets the item. Auction methods can be used, but they are usually limited to very specific settings. You would not be able to do an auction method in a supermarket to auction out a quantity of pasta or of Coke, for example. Now, what should a company do, however, if they have a very new product? Let's say Apple wants to introduce a self-driving car, and they want to find out how much they can charge for it. One way of doing this is called the conjoint analysis. And you might have heard about conjoint analysis in other classes, so I'm just giving you a relatively rough overview of what the method is about. Conjoint analysis is a special form of market research, let's say a special form of questionnaire, that helps you to understand how customers value different features of component of a product and how they make trade-offs. The underlying idea of conjoint analysis is that each product can be broken down into a bundle of features. Look at an airline ticket that you buy. The airline ticket, one component of it is the brand. One component of it is the amount of space you get when you sit. One component might be the free food, and there may be other components as well. And the last component is obviously the price. Look at the credit card, same thing. One component might be the brand, if it's an American Express or a Visa or a MasterCard. One component might be whether you get specific types of insurance with it. One component might be how it looks like, and so on and so on. And ultimately, one component is the price or the fee. The idea of conjoint analysis is that each component adds value to the product to varying degrees, except for price, which reduces the value of a product. For example, for a credit card, you may not really care whether it's an American Express or a MasterCard or a Visa, so the value of brand may be really, really low. You may, however, probably care a lot about the insurance, like a travel insurance, for example, so the value of insurance may be high. The same for an airline, where the brand and the space and the free food and whatever else you want to include create the value of a product. And ideally, you would like this product for free. So ideally, the price should be zero. But obviously, this is not the case. So the higher the price, the higher the negative value you associate to price. And the idea of conjoint analysis is to determine the price where the value which is decreased or destroyed by a price is just as large as the value that is created by all the other components. So where the entire value is zero. Now, in order to do conjoint analysis, you need to follow a series of steps. And usually data is collected in the form as you see it on this slide. What you usually show people is you show people different options or bundles of features, and you ask them to pick which one they would buy. Let's say if you wanted to buy a house, the style, option one is a modern house, 3 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms with an oil furnace, no garage at $650,000. Option 4 is a log rustic cabin, 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, an oil furnace with a garage and $750,000, and you have the other options in the middle. Which one would you pick? You see that this question is very, very different to asking you, imagine a modern house with 3 bedrooms, bathrooms, oil furnace, no garage, and how much would you want to pay for this? Or the question, would you buy it for $650 or not? Which are the questions that we had 2 slides earlier. What you are now asking is to ask people to evaluate whole options, whole feature bundles, and to decide which one they would pick, which is much, much closer to how people actually choose products in real life. Now, conjoint analysis can become very, very technical, so I want to briefly outline the main steps that are involved in a conjoint analysis. The first one is you need to decide which features to include. If you think about an airline, you could probably include 200 different features, going from the brand up to the color of the seat, whether it's red or green. But the problem is, the more features you include, the larger your survey gets, the more complicated your data collection gets. So you need to focus on features that are relevant, the most important ones, and that are believable, especially when they're seen in combination with each other. Because otherwise, the example may be very stylized and consumers may not be able to take a real decision based on this. In most real life situations, you will face the problems that there are too many features. So you need to decide which ones to focus on. And there are different statistical tricks that you can use. There is a specific type of conjoint analysis where you can actually use a lot of features, and you run a survey before to identify for each individual customer which feature is the most important for him or her. You can do like statistical stuff in order to reduce the space of the features you're looking at. If this is something that interests you, I added 2 articles into the Dropbox folder, into the folder of this class. The articles are relatively old, as you see on the slide below. They are from 78 and 90, but they give you a very good introduction into the issues related to conjoint analysis. Or alternatively, you can just go online and Google the different terms. There's a whole industry around conjoint analysis and a whole area of statistics associated with it. So it can get very technical very fast. Once you have selected the features, the next question is to identify how the features create value. Some features, for example, are linear. The larger the feature, the more value it creates. Look at space. A lot of leg space, if you sit in a plane, is always better than less leg space. Others may have an ideal point. Think of customization of an offer. If a company does not customize their offers at all, utility may be low. But if they customize it too much, you may feel scared and you may feel that you don't have a choice anymore. So too much may also not be good, which means there may be some form of ideal point in the middle, which leads to an inverse U-shape of the preference and utility function. And there may be any other type of combination. You need to identify how the preference model looks like for each individual attribute that you use in order to do the statistical analysis later. You then need to collect the data, which can either be based on a full profile approach, which is exactly what I showed you a couple of slides earlier, where you ask people to pick different options and compare them to each other and pick one of them. Or you can give people combinations of 2 factors. Like if you wanted to choose tires, for example, you can combine the brand with the lifetime of the tire and ask people to rank which type of option they would prefer. And finally, you need to decide how you present the data collection. Is it a verbal description? Do you draw a little picture? Or may the product be so complicated that you actually have to do physical prototypes? You need to decide of how you collect the data. Is it a rating scale? Do you like this product? Yes, from 7, I like it a lot, to 1, I don't like it at all. Do you ask people to rank the 4 different options? Do you ask people to allocate 100 points along the options? Do you ask people to only pick one of these options? And then ultimately, you need to analyze the data, which is usually done using some form of regression or discrete choice model. Conjoint analysis is probably the most powerful and in a certain way the most accurate way to measure price sensitivity. But you need to remember that it is very technical, can be very time consuming, and by consequence, it can be very costly because you may need a market research firm, a statistical consultant, a data collection agency. So it should only be used very, very carefully for really, really important decisions. If Apple thinks of introducing a self-driving car, a conjoint analysis might make sense. If Coca-Cola is thinking about introducing a vanilla flavored version of Coke, it might simply be an overkill.